Everyone laughed the first time they saw it. They stood in the doorway of his small log cabin, boots heavy with snow, breath rolling white into the air, and they laughed like it was the finest joke winter had ever told. The wind outside howled across the valley, rattling shutters and bending pine trees low, but inside that cabin the fire glowed steady and bright. And there, built along the wall beside a brick oven, sat the strangest bed any of them had ever laid eyes on. It was not made of feathers or straw. It was not carved oak or iron-framed like the store-bought ones in town. It was a solid slab of clay, smoothed by hand, resting over a low tunnel of brick and pipe that ran from the oven's belly. It looked more like a baker's bench than a place to sleep. He stood beside it that day, holding a lump of wet clay in one hand, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. His boots were still caked with frozen mud from the riverbank where he had dug the earth himself. His beard had caught flecks of clay and ash. He did not look like a man who cared much for laughter. "You planning to bury yourself in that thing?" one neighbor had asked. Another shook his head. "Clay don't keep a man warm. You'll wake up stiff as a fence post." They called it foolish. They called it desperate. A few called it plain madness. But they did not stay long enough to understand. The winter that year had come down hard on the valley. Snow began early and never truly stopped. The old-timers said they had not felt cold like that since they were boys. The creek froze solid by November. The cattle had to be brought close to the barns and fed twice as much. Wood piles shrank faster than anyone expected. Every night the sky turned sharp and clear, and the cold pressed down like a weight on the chest. In houses all across the valley, families huddled close to cast iron stoves, waking through the dark hours to feed the fire. Beds near the windows turned icy by morning. Blankets stiffened with frost where breath had settled. Sleep came light and broken. He had known winters like this before. He had grown up in a cabin smaller than the one he now lived in, back when the railroad had just started carving its way across the state. His father had been a mason, his mother a seamstress. They had not had much, but they had known how to work with their hands. From his father he learned how brick held heat long after flame died down. From his mother he learned patience, stitch by stitch. Years later, when he built his own place at the edge of the timberline, he built it sturdy, thick log walls, stone floor. A broad wood-fired oven of brick and mortar, wide enough to bake bread for a week. He liked the smell of oak burning, liked the way the heat settled into the stones and stayed there. One night, during the first deep freeze of that winter, he lay awake on his ordinary wooden bed. The fire had burned low. He had banked it carefully, but still the room cooled fast. He could feel the chill rising from the floorboards and creeping under his blankets. He stared at the ceiling beams and thought about the oven only a few steps away, still warm to the touch hours after the last log had burned down. Heat wasted, he thought. Heat drifting up the chimney and fading into the dark. By morning, the idea had settled firm in his mind. He began with the clay. There was good earth down by the bend in the river, thick and heavy. He hauled it back in sacks slung over his shoulders, mixed it with sand and straw, worked it with his boots until it turned smooth and ready. He shaped bricks first, letting them dry by the stove. Then he built the channel. It ran from the side of the oven, low and narrow, curving beneath where the bed would sit. A pipe carried the warmth from the oven's firebox through that tunnel before it reached the chimney. Instead of letting the heat escape all at once, he slowed it, spread it, guided it under the thick clay slab. The slab itself took days to shape. He pressed it by hand, smoothing the top with a wooden board until it lay flat and even. He built it thick, nearly the width of his palm from surface to bottom, so it could hold warmth long into the night. When it dried, it turned the color of old earth, firm and solid. By the time the neighbors first saw it, the structure was complete but not yet fired. They saw only a man who had traded a good wooden bed for a block of hardened mud. Word traveled fast in a small valley. By Sunday, men were talking about it outside the church doors. Women shook their heads while hanging laundry stiff with frost. Some said he had always been a bit too quiet, too fond of doing things his own way. Still, they were curious. The first true test came on a night when the temperature dropped lower than anyone could remember. The air bit at the lungs. The trees cracked in the forest like distant rifle shots. Inside most cabins, fires roared high and still the cold crept in. He prepared his oven as usual, feeding it split oak until the bricks glowed faint red in the back. He let the fire settle down to coals. Then he closed the draft halfway, forcing the hot air to travel its new path beneath the clay bed before slipping up the chimney. He laid a simple wool blanket over the slab, nothing thick, nothing special. Outside, the wind screamed against the logs. Inside, he waited. At first, the clay felt cool under his palm. Then slowly it began to change. A gentle warmth spread from the center outward. Not the sharp heat of flame, but a steady, deep warmth that seemed to rise from within the earth itself. He sat on the edge of the bed and listened. The oven ticked softly as brick expanded. The pipe carried a low hum of moving air. The warmth grew stronger, settling into the slab until it felt almost alive. He lay down fully clothed, unsure what to expect. The heat seeped through the blanket and into his bones. It wrapped around him from below, not just from above like a campfire. His back, his shoulders, his legs all felt the same steady comfort. For the first time in weeks, he did not feel the cold creeping up from the floor. He fell asleep before he realized it. Morning came pale and bright through the frost-lined window. Snow lay piled high against the cabin door. The fire in the oven had long since burned down to ash. Yet, when he pressed his hand to the clay, it was still warm. Not hot, not burning, just warm enough to make the room feel different from the rest of the world outside. That afternoon, one of the neighbors stopped by again, more out of curiosity than kindness. He stomped the snow from his boots and glanced at the clay bed with a half-smile. "Well," he said, "did your mud pile freeze you solid?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he placed his hand flat on the surface of the slab and nodded toward it. The neighbor stepped closer, laid his own gloved hand down, then pulled off the glove to feel it better. His eyebrows lifted. "It's still warm." He nodded once. "How much wood did you burn?" "No more than usual." The neighbor looked at the oven, then at the bed, then back again. The laughter that had come so easily days before did not return. By the end of the week, more folks had found reasons to pass by the cabin. Some brought small offerings of jam or dried venison, pretending it was a friendly visit. But their eyes always drifted to the clay oven bed. He explained it's simple and plain. The brick holds heat. The clay stores it. The pipe slows it down. Nothing magic about it. Just letting the warmth work longer instead of rushing away. Still, not everyone was convinced. One man claimed it would crack and crumble by spring. Another said it would smoke up the cabin and choke him out. A third insisted that sleeping on clay would ruin a man's back before winter was through. He listened to them all without anger, because each night, when the wind scraped ice across the window glass and the valley lay buried in snow, he lay down on that warm clay and slept deep and steady. He woke without frost on his blanket, without stiff fingers, without the ache that came from fighting cold for hours in the dark. And as the weeks passed, something else began to happen. Other cabins, not far from his, started running low on firewood. The winter showed no sign of easing. Supplies in town thinned, prices crept upward. The valley began to understand that this was no ordinary season. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the snowfields blue, a small group gathered outside his door. They did not laugh this time, they knocked. When he opened it, the wind rushed in sharp and biting. The men shifted on their feet, hats in their hands. "We've been thinking," one of them began carefully, "about that clay bed of yours." Behind him, the sky darkened. The temperature was already falling fast. Inside the cabin, the oven glowed steady. The clay slab waited, holding the promise of another warm night. He stepped back from the doorway, letting them see the quiet heat filling the room. And for the first time since the laughter began, the valley stood on the edge of something new, something that might change more than just one man's sleep. But outside, the wind was rising again, stronger than before, carrying with it a storm none of them had yet faced. The wind pushed hard against the cabin door as he stepped aside to let them in. Snow swirled at their boots and melted in small puddles across the stone floor. No one spoke at first. They stood close to the oven, rubbing their hands together, eyes moving slowly around the room until they settled once again on the clay oven bed. The warmth inside felt different from the warmth in their own homes. It was steady, even. It did not sting the skin or fade when you stepped away from the fire. It seemed to rise from the walls and floor, from the very bones of the cabin itself. One of the men crouched and reached under the clay slab, peering into the low brick channel. He could see the pipe running through it, black and solid, carrying the last of the evening heat from the oven. "You built this yourself," he said quietly. He nodded. "With my hands." Another man walked to the window and glanced out at the darkening valley. The storm was gathering fast. The sky had turned the color of iron, and the wind carried a fine snow that moved sideways instead of down. "Wood's running short," that man said. "Mine's near gone. I burned through half my stack just this past week," a murmur of agreement followed. They had all thought their stores would be enough. They had all believed winter would loosen its grip by now. Instead, it had tightened. He listened without speaking. He had known this moment would come, though he had not known when. Pride had kept them laughing at first. Pride was fading now. One of the younger fellows finally walked over to the clay bed and pressed both hands flat against it. His shoulders eased without him meaning to. "How warm does it get?" he asked. "Warm enough," he replied. "It holds heat long after the fire dies down. The clay takes it in slow and gives it back slow." They looked at one another. No one wanted to be the first to ask outright for help. Finally, the oldest among them cleared his throat. His beard was rimmed with frost, and his eyes had the weary look of a man who had seen many winters but did not trust this one. "You figure this could work in other cabins?" he asked. He glanced at the oven, at the pipe, at the thick slab he had shaped by hand. He thought of the riverbank clay, the long hours mixing and pressing, the careful fitting of brick so smoke would not leak into the room. "It could," he said, "but it's not quick work. You'd need to shape the clay right, lay the brick tight. If you rush it, it won't hold." Outside, the wind struck the cabin again, harder this time. The door rattled in its frame. The men shifted uneasily. They were not used to asking for guidance from someone they had laughed at days before. Yet the cold had a way of humbling a man. "We don't need fancy," one of them said. "Just something to keep our families warm through the night." He studied their faces. He knew each of them well enough. Knew their cabins, their children, the way smoke curled from their chimneys at dusk. He had grown up in this valley just as they had. He understood the pride that held them back, and the fear pressing in now. "It's not just about the bed," he said at last. "It's about how you run the oven. You have to let the heat travel. Most folks send it straight up the chimney. That's wasted warmth." They listened carefully now. He knelt by the oven and opened the small iron door, showing them how the draft could be adjusted. He traced the path of the pipe with his hand, explaining how the hot air was forced to move beneath the clay before escaping. "It's like storing summer in the earth," he said. "The clay remembers the fire." No one laughed at that. The storm broke fully before they left. Snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the valley in white silence. The men pulled their coats tight and hurried back toward their own homes, glancing over their shoulders once or twice at the warm glow spilling from his cabin window. That night, the temperature dropped lower than it had all season. In cabins across the valley, fires burned hot and fast. Wood cracked and snapped in iron stoves. Mothers tucked extra blankets around their children. Fathers lay awake listening to the wind scrape against the walls. In his cabin, the oven glowed steady. He fed it less wood than usual, careful and measured. When the bricks had absorbed enough heat, he let the fire settle and guided the draft so warmth would travel beneath the clay oven bed. He lay down as he had every night since building it. The heat rose up slow and deep, easing the tightness from his shoulders. The storm outside sounded distant, almost gentle. Yet even as he drifted toward sleep, a thought tugged at him. If the cold continued like this, more than comfort would be at stake. Wood piles would empty. Livestock would weaken. Supplies from town might stop altogether if the roads became impassable. The clay oven bed worked for one cabin. But could it help an entire valley before winter broke them? By morning, drifts had swallowed fences and buried the lower halves of doors. Smoke rose thin and pale from chimneys that still had fuel to burn. Other cabins showed no smoke at all until late in the day. A knock came at his door before noon. This time it was not a group of men but a woman from the far side of the creek. Her cheeks were red from the cold and worry showed plainly in her eyes. "I heard about your heating bed," she said without greeting. "They say it stays warm even after the fire dies." "It does?" he answered. "My youngest has been coughing through the night," she said. The cold settles in her chest. "We can't keep the room warm long enough." He felt something shift inside him at that. Laughter from neighbors was one thing, a child struggling for warmth was another. "You have brick in your oven?" he asked. "Some not as much as yours? And clay nearby?" She nodded toward the creek. "Plenty." He stepped aside and let her in, showing her the construction more closely than he had shown the others. He explained how thick the slab needed to be, how important it was to seal every joint with care so no smoke would leak into the sleeping space. He warned her that clay must dry slowly before firing or it would crack. "It takes patience," he said. "I have patience," she replied softly. "What I don't have is enough wood." By afternoon, word had spread further. 2 more families came seeking advice. The small cabin began to feel like a workshop rather than a quiet home. He found himself repeating the same instructions. Mix the clay with sand and straw. Shape it firm, build the brick channel steady and level. Let the heat travel before it escapes. Each time he spoke, he felt both pride and unease. Pride, because the thing they mocked was now a spark of hope. Unease, because winter was far from finished. Late that evening, after the last visitor had gone, he stepped outside to study the sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cold so sharp it felt like glass against the skin. Stars burned bright and clear overhead. Across the valley he could see small lantern lights moving between cabins. Men were already beginning to gather clay under the moonlight, unwilling to waste another day. He knew what that meant. They would work fast. Too fast, perhaps. Clay heating beds and masonry ovens were not toys. If the brick was laid wrong, smoke could fill a room. If the pipe was set poorly, heat would not travel as it should. A rushed job could leave a family colder than before. He worried they might see only the promise of warmth and not the care required to achieve it. The next morning he was woken by a distant shout. It carried faintly through the frozen air. He rose from his warm clay bed and pulled on his boots, stepping outside to see a thin column of smoke rising crooked from a cabin near the tree line. Too much smoke. He felt his chest tighten. Men had begun building their own versions already. He walked quickly through the snow, each step crunching loud in the stillness. As he drew closer, he could hear coughing from inside the cabin. The draft had not been set right. The smoke was not moving cleanly through the channel. When he reached the door, he paused, listening. The promise of stored heat, of sleeping warmer through the night, had stirred the valley, but hope handled without care could turn dangerous. He raised his hand to knock, knowing that whatever waited inside would test not just his idea, but his resolve. Behind him, the valley lay white and silent, balanced between survival and mistake, between warmth carefully guided and warmth gone wrong. And winter was only just settling in. He pushed the door open without waiting. The air inside the cabin was thick and sharp with smoke. Not enough to choke a man outright, but enough to sting the eyes and settle heavy in the lungs. A small fire burned in the oven, but the draft had been shut too tight. Heat was backing up, searching for a way out. The man of the house stood near the hearth, worry written across his face. His wife held a damp cloth over her mouth. 2 children sat close together on a wooden bench, eyes wide. "I followed what you said," the man insisted, voice rough. "Built the clay bed, laid the pipe, sealed the brick. But it ain't drawing right." He stepped past them and crouched by the oven. He could see it at once. The pipe dipped slightly before rising toward the chimney, a small sag no wider than a finger. That was enough. Hot air did not like to travel uphill after dipping. It pooled, then pushed back. "You rushed the leveling," he said quietly. The man's jaw tightened. "We didn't have time to wait. No one did." He adjusted the draft, then used a metal rod to shift the pipe just enough to correct the slope. It was not perfect, but it was better. Slowly, the smoke thinned. The air began to clear. The clay slab built against the wall was still pale and raw-looking. It had not fully dried before being fired. Fine cracks already traced along its surface like veins. You have to let it cure, he said. Clay needs time. If you push it too fast, it won't hold. The man looked at the cracks and then at his children. Time's what winter ain't giving us. That was the heart of it. The valley had grabbed hold of the idea of a clay oven bed because it promised something rare in that season. Control over heat, over firewood, over the long nights when cold crept into bone and would not let go. But control required patience, and patience was thin. He stayed until the draft ran steady and the smoke moved cleanly through the channel. When he stepped back outside, the cold hit him hard and clear. He drew in a long breath of clean air and stared at the white fields stretching toward the hills. The idea was spreading faster than he had expected. Over the next days, the valley changed its rhythm. Instead of chopping wood from dawn to dusk, men and older boys dug clay from the riverbank. Women mixed it with sand and straw in wooden troughs. Children carried small bricks to dry near stoves. Cabins that had never seen more than simple hearth repairs were now turning into workshops of brick and mortar. The sound of trowels scraping, of pipes being fitted, echoed faintly across the snow. Some came to him first for guidance. Others tried to copy what they had seen from a distance. He began moving from cabin to cabin, offering advice where he could. He showed them how to keep the brick channel smooth so air would not catch on rough edges. He explained how thermal mass worked in simple terms, how thick clay stored radiant heat and released it slow through the night. Most listened. A few did not. One neighbor, a proud man who had laughed the loudest at the start, refused to ask for help. He built his heating bed alone, working late into the night by lantern light. He stacked the clay higher than necessary, convinced that thicker meant warmer. He narrowed the channel too much, trying to trap as much heat as possible. When he finally lit the oven, the fire burned hot and bright. Too bright. Word reached him the next morning that the man's cabin had filled with smoke so heavy they had to throw open every window despite the freezing wind. The clay slab had grown so hot in one spot that it blistered the surface. No one was hurt. But the lesson spread quiet and heavy. Heat was not something to wrestle with. It had to be guided. As days passed, another problem began to show itself. The riverbank clay was not endless. The more they dug, the deeper the pits grew. Ice formed along the edges, making footing dangerous. Some cabins farther from the creek began hauling clay from less suitable ground, soil too sandy or too thin. Those beds did not hold warmth the same way. He noticed it when visiting a cabin near the ridge. The family had built their clay oven bed with soil scraped from a hillside. It dried fast and fired without cracking, but it never quite warmed the way it should. "It feels warm at first," the woman of the house said, pressing her hand to the slab. "But by midnight it cools." He crouched and examined the clay. Too much sand, not enough density. "Good clay is like good bread," he said. "You need the right mix?" She gave a tired smile. "Bread we can judge. Clay is new to us." Beyond the practical troubles, another tension was rising, quieter but just as sharp. Some in the valley began to speak of fairness. He had built the first clay oven bed. He knew how to shape it right. He knew how to balance the draft and manage the wood so that less fuel gave more warmth. Families who sought his help saw better results, others struggled. A few voices, low and cautious, began to question whether one man should hold knowledge that might mean the difference between comfort and hardship. He heard it first in passing, a remark near the general store in town when he went to trade for salt. "He ought to gather us all and show it proper," someone muttered. Another replied, "He's done enough already." The words were not angry, not yet, but they carried weight. He had never asked for anything in return, never charged a coin, yet the valley was changing around him. What began as laughter had turned to need, and need was turning to expectation. One evening, as he walked back from helping a family reset their pipe alignment, he found a small stack of split oak leaning against his cabin wall. No note, no sign of who left it. A gift. The next day, a sack of dried beans appeared on his doorstep. Gratitude mixed with something else, dependence. He did not want to become the keeper of warmth, the man everyone turned to whenever smoke failed to draw or clay cracked under pressure. He had built the oven bed to sleep warmer through the night, not to carry the weight of the valley on his shoulders. Yet, when the wind rose and the temperature dropped again, there was no turning away. The cold seemed to deepen as more cabins altered their heating systems. Some burned less wood and felt relief. Others, unsure of their construction, burned more to compensate, eating through dwindling supplies faster than before. A divide began to form, subtle but present. In cabins where the clay oven beds were built carefully, families slept steady; in others, nights remained restless. Whispers of envy and doubt moved through the valley like a second wind. One afternoon, the proud neighbor who had refused help came to his door at last. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed from poor sleep. "It ain't holding heat right," he admitted, voice low. "Burned near twice the wood I used to, and still it cools before dawn." He stepped aside and let him in without a word. As they stood by the oven, he saw the strain in the man's posture. Pride was a heavy coat to wear through winter. "You narrowed the channel too much," he said after examining the build. "Heat's backing up and racing out the chimney before the clay can take it in." The man exhaled slowly. "Can it be fixed?" "Yes," he answered. "But we'll have to tear part of it down." The thought of undoing days of hard labor tightened the man's jaw. Still, he nodded. As they worked side by side, brick by brick, something shifted between them. The laughter from weeks before felt distant now. In its place was a quiet understanding that winter did not care about pride. Yet even as cooperation grew in some corners, another worry pressed in. The weather showed no sign of breaking. Snowfall grew heavier, burying the lower paths between cabins. Supply wagons from town stopped coming altogether. The general store sent word that flour and lamp oil were running thin. The clay oven beds had bought warmth, but they had not shortened winter. He lay awake one night on his own slab, feeling its steady heat beneath him, listening to the wind scrape ice along the window pane. He thought about the riverbank clay pits, now deep and slick. He thought about the growing expectation in his neighbor's eyes. What would happen if the cold worsened still? What if the clay cracked in several cabins at once? What if someone sealed a draft too tight in desperation and smoke filled a room before morning? The warmth beneath him felt solid, reliable. Yet the valley around him felt fragile, balanced on careful brick and hope. Just before dawn he heard another knock at his door. Not hurried. Not panicked. Slow, measured. He rose from the clay oven bed, pulled on his coat, and stepped toward the sound, knowing that whatever waited outside would not be simple. Winter had settled deep into the valley, and the clay that promised 60 degrees warmer sleep might yet test them all in ways none of them were ready for. He opened the door to find the oldest man in the valley standing there alone. Snow clung to his shoulders, and his hat was pulled low against the wind. His face looked thinner than it had just weeks before. "We need to gather," the old man said. "All of us." The tone in his voice carried more than simple concern. It carried weight. The kind that settles before something breaks. Within the hour, word had spread from cabin to cabin. Lanterns flickered to life in the late afternoon gloom as families made their way through, knee-deep snow toward the largest barn near the center of the valley. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with another coming storm. He walked there slowly, boots crunching over hardened drifts, feeling the eyes of neighbors on him. Some nodded in quiet respect, others looked uncertain. The clay oven beds had changed the valley, but not evenly. Warmth had come to some more easily than to others. Inside the barn, the air was cold, but still. Lantern light swayed against wooden beams. Faces glowed in amber shadows. Men stood with arms folded. Women held shawls tight around their shoulders. Children clung close, listening even if they did not understand. The old man stepped forward first. "We are burning less wood in some homes," he began, voice steady but strained. "But in others, wood is running out faster than before. Clay has helped, yes, but not every build has worked the same." A murmur passed through the crowd. One man spoke up from the back. "My heating bed holds fine. We sleep warmer than ever," another cut in. "Mine cracked clear through after 2 nights. Now the draft won't draw right," a woman's voice followed. "We dug clay from the far bank, but it don't hold heat like yours." All eyes slowly turned toward him. He felt the weight settle across his shoulders. He had never wanted to stand in front of the valley like this. He had built his clay oven bed to survive winter in his own cabin. Now the whole community looked to him as if he held a cure. "It's not magic," he said quietly. "It's brick clay and careful draft." If the clay's wrong or the pipe's set wrong, the heat won't travel as it should. We know that, someone replied. But we need more than advice passing from porch to porch, the old man nodded. We need a plan. The word hung there. Outside, the wind began to rise again, rattling the barn doors. Snow tapped against the wooden walls like scattered pebbles. A younger fellow stepped forward. The riverbank clay is near used up where we've been digging. The pits are deep and slick. One of the boys near slipped in yesterday, another added. Wood's near gone in the northern cabins. Even with the heating beds, we still need fire to charge them. The truth was simple and sharp. The clay oven beds had stretched warmth further into the night. Some said they slept nearly 60 degrees warmer at their backs than before, but they still relied on wood to feed the ovens, and wood piles were shrinking. We could dig together, someone suggested. Organize it proper, share clay, and share wood, another said. That idea did not pass as easily. Wood was life in winter. Sharing meant trusting that the supply would last. He stepped forward then, feeling he could not remain silent any longer. If we build the beds right, he said, each cabin will burn less wood overall. The clay stores heat deep, but the build must be right. We cannot rush it. If we work together, we can fix the cracked ones and improve the weak ones. A man near the door frowned. And who decides what's right? No anger, but challenge. He met the man's eyes. Heat decides. Smoke decides. If it draws clean and holds warmth through the night, it's right. The wind slammed hard against the barn, making several children jump. The storm had arrived faster than expected. Lantern flames flickered. The old man raised a hand. We have two choices. We go back to each cabin and hope our own wood lasts. Or we stand together, pool what we have, and make these heating beds strong in every home. Silence followed. Outside, the snow thickened, blowing nearly sideways. The path back to each cabin would not be easy if they waited too long. Finally, the proud neighbor who once laughed stepped forward. His voice carried through the barn. I built mine wrong, he admitted openly. Burned twice the wood for half the heat. He helped me tear it down and fix it. Now it holds steady. I say we trust what's been proven. There it was. Not praise, but proof. The tension shifted slightly, but it did not vanish. Plans began forming quickly. At first light, those with strong builds would help those with weak ones. Clay would be dug in organized groups, safer and steadier. Wood would be measured and rationed more carefully, charging ovens only as much as needed to heat the clay mass. It sounded simple when spoken. But winter does not bend easily to plans. By nightfall, the storm had buried the valley under fresh drifts. Visibility shrank to only a few yards. The temperature dropped again, sharp and bitter. He returned to his cabin and fed the oven carefully, watching the flame catch and settle. He adjusted the draft so the heat would travel slow beneath the clay slab. The pipe hummed softly. As he lay down, the warmth rose steady through the blanket. Yet his mind did not rest. Tomorrow would test more than clay and brick. It would test patience, trust, and the strength of neighbors who had once stood laughing at the idea of sleeping on hardened earth. Morning came buried in white. The valley looked transformed, almost erased. Fences disappeared beneath drifts. Paths were gone. The river lay hidden under ice and snow. Still, figures moved through the cold. Small groups trudged from cabin to cabin, carrying tools and lanterns. Smoke rose thicker than usual as ovens were lit early to begin adjustments. He spent the first half of the day reinforcing a cracked slab near the ridge. The clay had split from uneven drying. They patched it carefully, smoothing fresh mixture into the seam and guiding heat gently so it would not fracture again. Slow, he kept repeating. Let the thermal mass take heat gradual. By midday his gloves were stiff with frozen clay. His beard held flecks of ice. But cabin after cabin began to show improvement. Smoke flowed cleaner. Heat settled deeper into the slabs. Then, as afternoon light faded, a shout carried across the snow from the northern edge of the valley. He turned at once. A thin column of dark smoke twisted upward, thicker than it should have been. Not the light gray of clean burn, but dense and uneasy. Several men began moving toward it without being told. His stomach tightened. The northern cabins had the least wood remaining. If someone had pushed their oven too hard trying to charge the clay quickly, the draft could have failed again. They pushed through snowdrifts that reached their knees, breath coming hard in the freezing air. The wind had begun to rise once more, blowing sharp crystals into their faces. As they neared the cabin, they could hear coughing inside. He felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. The clay oven bed had promised warmth, maybe even 60 degrees warmer than old wooden frames that let cold seep up from the floor. It had offered a way to stretch dwindling wood supplies. It had brought hope to a valley pressed hard by winter. But hope handled without care could still falter. He reached the door first and pressed his hand against the wood. It felt warmer than expected, too warm. He glanced back at the others, their faces pale under frost. "Open it slow," he said. The door creaked inward. A wave of thick heat rolled out, mixed with heavy smoke. Inside, the oven roared hotter than it should have. The draft had been forced wide open in desperation. The clay slab glowed faintly at one corner where flame had pushed too hard through the channel. A family stood near the far wall, eyes wide. "We needed more heat," the father said hoarsely. "The wood's near gone. I thought if I burned it hotter, it would charge the bed faster." The tension in the room felt like a pulled rope ready to snap. He stepped forward, heart pounding, knowing that the next moments would decide more than just one cabin's warmth. Outside, the wind rose again and snow began to fall harder, swallowing the valley in white silence as everything balanced on careful brick. Fragile clay and the steady hope that this old American valley could hold together long enough to see spring. He moved fast but steady. "Close the draft halfway," he called out over the roar of the oven. "Not wide open. You're sending the heat too quick." One of the men behind him stepped forward and adjusted the iron lever. The flame inside the firebox shifted, no longer raging upward but settling into a deeper burn. The pipe beneath the clay oven bed rattled faintly as the flow of hot air changed direction. "Open the window just a hand's width," he said next. "Let the smoke clear slow." "Don't throw it wide?" The father of the house did as told, hands shaking. The air inside was thick and heavy, but already the sharpness began to fade. The glow in the corner of the clay slab dulled from red to a softer orange. "You can't force it," he said quietly, stepping closer to the heating bed. "The clay stores heat over time. If you push the fire too hard, it outruns the mass. You waste wood and risk cracking the slab." The man swallowed. "We thought more flame meant more warmth. It means more loss if it moves too fast." He crouched and placed his palm against the surface of the clay. It was hot, but not ruined. The channel beneath was still intact. The brick had held. "You built it strong," he said, glancing up at the family. "You just need to trust it." Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin the heat began to settle into a steady rhythm. The roaring sound softened into a deep hum as the hot air moved evenly through the pipe. The clay oven bed absorbed the warmth instead of fighting it. The children coughed less. The mother lowered the cloth from her mouth and took a careful breath. Relief moved through the room, slow but certain. They stayed until the fire steadied and the smoke cleared completely. No one spoke much as they worked. The lesson did not need more words. The heating system was not about bigger flames. It was about control, about guiding the draft and letting the thermal mass do its quiet work. When they stepped back outside, snow had piled against the cabin walls. The storm had reached its peak. The valley lay hidden beneath layers of white. He looked at the men beside him. Faces that once carried doubt now showed something else, understanding. "We need to teach this proper," one of them said. "All of it. Not just how to build the clay bed, but how to run it." He nodded. "Every family. No shortcuts." The next morning, the valley did something it had never done before. Instead of each cabin tending to its own survival in silence, they gathered in small groups and moved from house to house. They checked every brick channel. They measured every pipe slope. They tapped on every clay slab, listening for hollow spots or cracks. They did not wait for problems to grow. They solved them together. At the riverbank, they dug clay carefully now, reinforcing the sides of the pits so no one would slip. Those with strong backs carried extra loads for the older men. Women mixed the clay with better judgment, adding sand in the right balance and straw in careful handfuls. Children learned to recognize good clay by feel, squeezing it between their fingers and nodding when it held shape. In each cabin, the story was the same. The oven would be fired steady, not wild. The draft would be adjusted slowly, not forced. The clay oven bed would be allowed to warm gradual, storing radiant heat deep within its mass. And night by night something changed. The valley began to sleep. Not in luxury, not in summer warmth, but in comfort enough to rest. Backs no longer stiffened from cold floors. Blankets did not frost at the edges. Families woke to rooms that still held heat from the night before. Word spread quietly that some cabins were measuring nearly 60 degrees warmer at the surface of their clay beds compared to the old wooden frames that once sat above frozen boards. It was not magic, it was masonry, patience, and shared effort. Wood piles, though still shrinking, lasted longer now. Instead of burning through logs at full roar, families learned to charge their masonry ovens once in the evening and let the thermal mass carry them through the dark hours. The proud neighbor who once laughed hardest became one of the most careful teachers. He showed others how he had corrected his own mistakes, how narrowing the channel too much had caused smoke to back up, how widening it slightly had allowed the heat to travel smooth and even. The woman from across the creek sent word that her youngest was sleeping through the night without coughing. The warmth from the clay heating bed stayed steady beneath her thin mattress. The old man who called the first gathering began keeping notes in a small ledger. He wrote down which clay mixtures held best, which pipe lengths drew cleanest, which draft positions worked for different cabin sizes. What began as one man's experiment turned into shared knowledge. And still, winter lingered. Snowstorms came and went. The sky remained hard and pale for weeks more. Supply wagons did not return until late in the season. But the panic that once hovered over the valley faded into something steadier. They were no longer reacting. They were prepared. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the snowfields gold, he stood outside his cabin and watched smoke rise from every chimney. Not thick and desperate, but thin and controlled. He stepped back inside and closed the door gently behind him. The oven glowed warm, not raging. The clay slab radiated a deep, even heat. He ran his hand across its surface and felt the same quiet strength he had felt that first night. There had been laughter once. He could still hear it if he thought back hard enough. Boots in his doorway. Jokes about burying himself in mud. Warnings that clay would never keep a man warm. He smiled to himself, not out of pride, but out of understanding. They had not laughed because they were cruel. They had laughed because they did not know. Because new ideas in an old American valley take time to root. He lay down on the clay oven bed, feeling its warmth rise steady through the blanket. Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the logs, no longer howling with the same fury. A soft knock came at his door. He rose and opened it to find a small group standing there, not in worry, not in panic, but carrying something wrapped in cloth. "We thought you might join us tonight," the old man said. "Supper at the barn. Thought it was time we marked this winter proper." He stepped outside, pulling his coat tight. The sky above was clear for the first time in days. Stars shimmered sharp and bright. At the barn, long tables had been set up. Simple food filled the boards, bread baked in masonry ovens. Stew kept warm on steady coals. Laughter rose into the cold air, softer now, warmer. Children ran between the lanterns without shivering. Mothers spoke easily. Fathers leaned back without the tight strain that winter had carved into their faces. Someone raised a cup and nodded toward him. Not as a hero, not as a savior, just as a neighbor who had shared what he knew. "You built more than a clay bed," the old man said quietly beside him. "You built a way for us to hold on." He shook his head. "We all built it, and that was the truth of it." The clay oven bed was only brick and earth shaped by hand. The heating system was only draft and pipe guiding hot air beneath a slab. The promise of sleeping 60 degrees warmer came not from one man's idea alone, but from a valley willing to learn, to correct mistakes, and to trust steady work over quick fixes. When spring finally came, it did not arrive loud. It crept in slow, snow softened along the edges of fences. Ice cracked on the river. The first trickle of water ran beneath the bridge. Cabin doors opened wider. Clay pits at the riverbank filled with meltwater and would soon green over again. The heating beds remained solid and quiet against cabin walls. They would not be needed as fiercely through summer, but they stood as proof of what careful hands and shared effort could do. On the first mild evening, he stood outside and looked across the valley. Smoke rose thin and light. Children's voices carried through open air. The long winter had not broken them. He stepped back into his cabin one last time before dusk and ran his hand across the clay slab. It was cool now, resting after months of work. Everyone had laughed at his clay oven bed once. Now it was simply part of the valley, as natural as brick and timber, as trusted as fire itself. And when the next winter came, as it always would, they would be ready.